Sin is a concept unique to the Abrahamic religions, but beyond the appropriation of the word sin into our modern culture, what actually is sin? How do we define it? And what does it do to us? What happens when a worldview lacks the concept of sin? Today, we're going to get into the nitty-gritty of sin, what it is and what it does. Then we're going to discuss the 7 deadly sins, the unforgivable sin, and the implications of the concept of sin within your worldview. Hey, I'm Bailey.
I'm Michael.
And I'm David.
And welcome back to the Face in the Gates podcast. It has been quite the hot minute. It has probably been like 2 or 3 months since we put out an episode. Probably been like 3 or 4 months since we've recorded an episode. And these are not excuses. I mean, they are, but what we have legitimate reasons. A lot of things have happened in our lives since then. So back in the beginning of October, I got a job and moved to Nashville. And then about a month later, Michael moved to Atlanta. So we're all in different places now, and we're recording the rest of this show pretty much digitally. So just is there anything you want to update people on like, you know, your life, on what all has been happening since, you know, it's been a hot minute since we've recorded?
Oh no, besides I got the hell out of Aiken, because Aiken sucks.
Yeah, sorry David.
Sorry. I left him to live alone.
Yeah, I got a giant pet rock. I think I win this one.
Oh no, I got fiber. I got fiber internet. Okay.
I got fiber internet too. Oh, it's so good. I used to have like 6 meg download. Bro, and now I've got like 300. I could get more, but I don't need it. So anyway,
I've got almost 300 and the router is like a floor above me.
Uh-huh.
And the walls are like concrete brick.
Yeah.
And most of where I'm at is like underground.
Wow.
And I am still getting almost 1-to-1. It's crazy.
Nice, dude. Cool. Yeah, so basically, that was really just it. One thing as to why things got why we ended up taking a break. So when we were recording the church visitations and pastoral interview episodes, we had kind of bulk recorded those, because we would record an interview one weekend and then the next day we would go to the church and then do our thoughts. So we would be doing like 2 episodes a week. And so we kind of got a bunch of those stockpiled for a little while.
Yeah, we did it week after week after week after week.
Right. So we had quite a few of those stockpiled, and we were kind of anticipating, you know, we knew we were going to move at some point, but we were hoping that we would have a bunch of episodes recorded to cover that period of time. And we had it to cover part of that time, but not all of it. And then, you know, just getting set up and all took a little while. So apologies for being so late. But anyway, I'm done rambling, and we're gonna talk about sin now. AKA David,
the big bad
sin incarnate.
We all are. Dun, dun.
All right. Anyway, just as kind of like an intro expose, I guess. Not expose. That's not the right word. Prelude. I don't know. Anyway, what do you think sin is? How would you define sin? I'm going to hand this over to you guys.
Well, to me, in my interpretation of it, it is any morally apprehensible thing that can be anywhere from minute to grandiose. Grandiose, whatever the word is. Yeah.
You're good.
And so essentially, any wrongdoing unto another person or even yourself can be considered sin. Or I also look at it like any wrongdoing towards your greater environment. Like if you go burn down a bunch of trees in a whole forest, that's a sin.
All right. David?
Pretty much the same. I was waiting for Michael to see if he would add like the kind of societal impact aspect to it. Because, I mean, if you look at them, especially the classic ones we'll touch upon, a lot of it could be seen as like, oh yeah, that's bad for society in general.
Right. Because I guess in general, like, you know, there's sins that affect you. There's sins that affect other people. There's sins that affect the world at large. So yeah, that's kind of getting at a lot of the specifics that we're going to talk about later. But there's a lot of angles I want to kind of talk about this from in this episode. But also, as a preface, as I said in a previous episode, I think it was my interview, I basically said that sin is sin, and being that all sin is the same in God's eyes, different types of sin will have different life consequences. So basically, I just said all sin is the same. I've kind of changed my mind on this. I don't believe that all sin is the same in God's eyes. I believe there are absolutely more severe sins with consequences both in this life and with God himself. So I just wanted to amend that because that occurred to me in my brain as I was writing this episode out. But that all being said, I have gathered a few definitions of sin, and we can kind of discuss them and talk about their implications, and then hopefully come to define it a little bit better. So the first one I have is sin is disobeying God's moral law, and this is kind of taken from Genesis. Discuss.
Well, I think to me, that in a theistic worldview, that makes sense because morals are gained from a higher sense. And it's kind of like, especially in the Judeo-Christian world, God kind of set this all in motion. And with the start of the first sin, all of them were based upon things not to do in his glory, his eyes. Because nudity wasn't seen as a sin. It's only once sin was enveloped that they saw that as wrong. And so to me, that in essence to me is a easy, simple way to explain the grander scale of what sin is.
Okay. To kind of play off of that, technically, if you want to get technical about it, from my perspective at least, ways, nudity isn't technically a sin. It is what your thoughts and actions are after that, which were exacerbated by the fall.
Yeah.
Cool. All right.
And
Well,
also,
anyway, sorry. Go ahead.
I think our lens with like nudity and stuff like that has been changed due to the climate that we live in.
Yeah.
Because we're all clothed. We don't just walk around showing our bits to everybody. Because we as a society see that as either something apprehensive or something we want.
Right. Okay. David, did you have anything to add about that, or?
Nah, just listening to y'all saying what I can give a little different, but so far, pretty much the same viewpoint.
Okay. The next one is sin as lawlessness, which is taken from the book of John. What do you think about that one?
I think it falls into what you perceive the law as. Because, for example, if in some people's eyes, killing someone for stepping on your property is legal. But in other places, that's seen as, why would you do that? And there are laws set in that kind of view. It falls into what your viewpoint and your society's viewpoint of law is. Because we all understand law is pretty much the agreed upon rules that you follow.
Mm-hmm.
But those vary in that aspect.
Yeah, but with the context given from the source, that to me says that the laws placed forth in the religion are the ones that hold the most weight in my eyes, because society is created by man who is imperfect, and therefore the laws we create can be imperfect.
Right.
And so to me, looking at the context, I think that's kind of where I fall on that, where like earthly laws, yeah, there's a lot of unjust laws. We all have read and seen things of horrific laws that do irreparable damage to society. But when looking at it from the religious worldview, it's very much, these are the laws that you have to follow as a follower of this religion. Like the 10 Commandments, 10 laws right there in your face.
I think kind of the idea behind sin as lawlessness is basically sin is a rejection of moral law, which is kind of a reiteration of the Genesis point, which, to be fair, John is kind of playing off of Genesis with a lot of the poetic elements in John, in the beginning of John, at least ways. Okay, cool. So let's move on to the next one. Sin as unbelief. According to Martin Luther, out of unbelief, sin flows. Now, I will asterisk this and say that I don't believe that unbelief is a sin, but unbelief leads to sin because sin is no longer relevant to someone who doesn't believe. All right, what are your thoughts?
I'd say it might not make it irrelevant to the person, but it does allow for a different mindset where if I'm not either checking myself or being checked over the motives and actions I take, that does lead to the ability to not care about the sin I'm doing. One example is, look at long-term prisoners who are in there for life, where law doesn't really matter to them anymore. They're not going home and they're going to die there. A lot of the times when you look at that, they don't have a reason to withhold themselves from doing sin, or they don't have any positive motives. No one's checking them in a grander scheme to push forward. Whereas the ones who either fall into a religion or a job in jail or prison, since it's long term, they will usually have something checking them, whether it's a higher power, whether it's your ability to have that freedom to go to work, or your freedom to go get goods and supplies.
Okay, gotcha. So, I think, not to put words in Martin Luther's mouth, but I think what he was trying to get at by sin being unbelief is when we sin, what we're really saying is we don't really believe in what God is saying. We'd rather do things ourselves. And this kind of gets at another definition that I'm going to talk about here in a little bit, because we're going to get to the more juicy ones here pretty soon. But yeah. Okay, so the next one would be sin as something that harms you, someone else, or your relationship with God. This is from my old youth pastor. That's one of the few things that has actually really stuck with me.
Yeah, I mean, I can't disagree with that, because that's, even if you're not going by a religious standpoint and you're going more on the moral standpoint, that's what doing bad does. And it doesn't matter if it's Christian, Jewish, Islam, doing sinful actions hurts you, everyone around you, and your relationship with God. Also, I don't think it's picking up, but there is a siren in the background.
Yeah, there
I
I'll
do
let you know.
vaguely hear it.
But yeah,
Cool.
that's that's again one of the few things I will agree with him on.
Yeah, for
Yeah.
the most part, I agree. At least for like the major kind of sins, like stealing from someone. The only kind of gray areas with like telling a little white lie, but that gets into more ethical implications and ethical viewpoints. Oh, good
Yeah.
old moral
Oh,
philosophy.
there's definitely some gray areas.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're not here
But
to debate the
so-
gray areas today, though.
Oh, no. But from kind of a basic standpoint, before like, this stuff might be okay, might not. Yeah. It's hard to
All right.
lost my train of thought.
Yeah. But
But yeah,
when people are saying these things, they're usually trying to brush with broad strokes because we could sit here and talk about gray area all day on,
Right.
well, maybe in this circumstance, but just
Yeah.
in general, I
Yeah.
have to agree with it.
Cool. Okay, so the next one is sin as hatred and rejection of God. This is from Father Stephen DeYoung. What do you guys think about that one? That's a juicy one.
Yeah, that one's a lot to break down in just short amount of words.
Right. Yeah.
Because again, when you look at the philosophical idea of sin and how it envelops itself into Christianity or Judaism or Islam, essentially that is essentially what it is. It is the human mind separating itself from God. But in real world terms, I don't necessarily agree with that statement because we as creatures are naturally sinful. We are naturally imperfect. And so I don't think on the human psyche, by committing a sin, it is necessarily hatred and rejection. So don't necessarily speak. On the philosophical side, I see where that comes from. But on the realistic, earthly side, it's a little too broad of a stroke for me. How about you, David? How you feel about that one?
essentially kind of same mindset, because hatred is, especially in our viewpoint, hatred is something you intentionally do. Hatred is kind of premeditation for it.
It is dislike with purpose.
Yeah.
I think what he's trying to get at behind this is not an explicit, outright, direct hatred and rejection of God, but an implicit one that ultimately it's a much deeper, like, spiritual standpoint on it. Like in our spirit, this is where we're rebelling, we're hating and rejecting God when we sin. But that's also like what is natural, and that is a result of the fall. And just because it's natural doesn't mean it's good. But
Yeah.
anyway,
Yeah, I think it just comes down to a lot of semantics and the way we all process these words and look at them
Right.
from different lights.
okay. So the last one I have here is sin as wanting to be your own God. And that is essentially what I would boil down sin to be. That's basically my definition.
Yeah.
Sin is kind of wanting to take control of your life, do what you want to do, and have no relation or connection to God, and just do what you want to do because you want to be God.
Reminds me of old Anton Lavey.
Yeah, for the it's kind of like the parent and the child. The child wants to be grown. The parent is grown.
The child rebels so they can be grown.
Yeah. And for some people, that rebellion leads back to becoming their parent. And then for others, that leads them to try to be their own parent. So I can get behind that standpoint, because looking at it for like the parent and child, because essentially the father, all of us, we're way down here and he's way up there. And so I can get behind that. I don't explicitly agree because I haven't settled my mindset in that yet, but I can get behind that.
Okay. Cool. Well, I think those are all of the definitions that we're going to philosophize about.
Yeah.
Hopefully
I just love how the last one is essentially what modern day Satanism is about. Not that we believe in Satan, but essentially you are your own power. You treat yourself as a god.
Right.
As I was joking
which
with
is
Lady.
Well, there's like, on that topic, there's like the Satanic Temple, which is just a troll group, basically.
A political troll group at that.
Especially, yeah. But ultimately, like, at the end of the day, like, what they're going for is like making yourself your own god. That is like, even though they're not intending it to be, like, that is like basically actual Satanism. Because that is the direct rejection of God, which is satanic.
Yeah, unintentionally, because most people think Satanism's like worshiping the devil, but I've met modern day Satanists,
Satanists,
but I've never met an actual devil worshiper.
Right, so that gets complicated because there's like actual Satanists who actually make sacrifices to Satan and shit like that. Those are very rare. And then there's like the troll group, the Satanic Temple, who inadvertently are acting in a satanic way.
Religion for atheists.
Yeah, essentially.
Sure. Yeah, exactly. Cool. Well, now that we've talked about Satanism, back to the sin thing. On those definitions, hopefully they the different perspectives have painted a somewhat less than vague picture of what sin is. Because in my opinion, to give an exact, precise definition of sin is difficult because it can't be narrowly defined. But if I had to put it bluntly, I would say that sin is any choice that we make that separates us from God. The effects of sin can manifest in your own life in a very practical sense, like getting drunk and driving drunk and getting arrested. But the spiritual effects of sin are what we have to train ourselves to become more aware of. It has a numbing effect on our hearts, and it begins to deafen our moral conscience.
Yeah. And I think what a lot of people struggle with that is we look at like big sins when we explain sin to children or to peers, and we don't explicitly go into how even small sins have a reaction. No matter how minute it might be, there's still something pushing back.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
So the crux of sin, one problem with sin is that it is addictive. The more you engage in sinful acts, the stronger propensity you have towards that sin, and the more numb you get to acknowledging that certain act even is a sin. You begin to make excuses and lie to yourself about your true motives. Before I move on to the next point, I don't know if you guys have thoughts on that. I kind of do make some controversial statements in these couple episodes.
Yeah. I mean, for me personally, us as humans innately look for patterns, look for things to, for lack of better terms, become obsessed or addicted to, whether that is positive patterns, whether that's negative patterns. That's the way we as a social creature move. Because even some people use religion as a drug. They won't allow themselves to think because they'll just drown themselves out with what everyone else is saying. And it's that feedback loop. And same thing for someone who shoplifts every day. It becomes an innate part of their cycle that they cannot find themselves getting out of. Same with like smoking, because there's chemical addiction, but there's also, it's bad for you, but it's habit. You keep coming back because it gives you that loop.
So the New Testament views life as salvation, while death is the rejection of God. So if sin separates us from God, then sin is quite literally then flirting with death. The more you sin, the more likely you are to become complacent, rationalize your behavior, and resist moral change. This is called pride. It is like a consuming cancer. This puts you in a deadly situation when it comes to salvation, because you can choose to ignore God. He will never force your hand. More on the topic of grace in the next episode, though. All right. Well, we're going to move into the 7 deadly sins. Not the anime. Yeah. So delicious. I actually didn't know that was an anime until I Googled that, because I'm not a weeb, so...
There's been like 100 crappy B movies called The 7 Deadly Sins, though, so...
Okay.
I didn't even know it was an anime till you just told me.
Okay, well, now you know. The more you know. Anyway, I will say I'm not, before I get into this, I'm not a pastor, so I don't really have the wisdom to give you on like what these, how to not do these things, how to avoid them. That would, I'm going to defer that to an actual pastor. Like, just go to church and be like, hey, how do I work on this? Because I don't have that authority, so I'm not going to do that. But what I am going to do is I'm going to go through them and say what they are, and then say what the inverse of them are, so we can kind of know, just have like some direction, I guess, some orientation. Yeah,
because most people do just talk about here are the sins, not hey, what's kind of the opposite of that? What do we at least view the opposite as?
Yeah. So, go ahead.
Because every action has an opposite and equal reaction. Checkmate, atheist.
Right. All right. Anyway, there are differing views upon these sins depending on what theological tradition you're a part of. So without getting into the weeds of those in-house debates, we can say for certain that these 7 types of sin are major vices that lead to other sins and can have a particularly strong hold on the individual. Now, each of these 7 sins are contrasted by the 7 fruits of the Spirit. So, just going in, I guess, kind of no particular order. The first one is sloth, and that would be defined as laziness that keeps us from doing our duty to God and to man. This is contrasted with diligence. Do we have any thoughts on? Do you guys want to like stop me after each one, or do you just want me to go through them?
Honestly, you can go through them.
Okay. The second one is wrath or anger, which is unworthy irritation and lack of self-control. As a side point, I don't believe that getting angry as an emotion is a sin, to be clear. After all, the Bible often describes God as an angry God or wrathful or vengeful, but his wrath is righteous and warranted. Anger can be a very productive emotion. It is what you do with that anger that matters. This is contrasted with patience. The third one is gluttony, which is an inordinate desire to consume more than that which one requires. This is contrasted with temperance. The fourth one is envy, which is the desire for others' traits, status, abilities, or situation. And this is contrasted with gratitude. Number 5 is lust, which is an inordinate craving for the pleasures of the body. And this is contrasted with chastity. Number 6 is greed/covetousness, which is the desire for material wealth or gain, ignoring the realm of the spiritual. And this is contrasted with charity. And the last one is pride/vanity, This is the excessive belief in one's own abilities that interferes with the individual's recognition of the grace of God. This is viewed as the chief of sins because it leads to the other 6 deadly sins, which themselves lead to other form of sin. So it's kind of like this hierarchy is like pride is at the top, and that leads to the other deadly sins, and those lead to other sins. I believe the essence of all sin is pride, the cardinal sin of wanting to be your own God without reference or subservience to the Creator. And this is contrasted with humility. All right, I'll let you guys give your thoughts on those.
Yeah, I gotta agree with you that pride definitely leads down the line to the others. It's that initial pride that just keeps on building and building and pulling itself out in different ways, whether it's in another deadly sin or in of itself. And also on the flip side, I think one of the greatest fruits is humility, because it's through humility we're able to continue and do all the others, like temperance or chastity. It's through that humility of knowing oneself and keeping at that level that you're able to pursue those fruitful endeavors.
Right. It is worth saying that some of these sins/virtues come more naturally to some than others. What is considered virtuous in the Christian life is to struggle against your own unique sinful predispositions and to acquire virtue. So, that all being said, now that we know what the 7 deadly sins are, obviously, as I mentioned, depending on what Christian tradition you belong to, they're going to tell you more about those. And they're going to say, like Catholics have a very thought out exposition and explanation for what these things are and what they do. Whereas your local Baptist church may not, exacerbate these in great detail. It just kind of depends on where you are. And I'm not here to tell you which one's right. Like, you just know that they're there and know that they do have effects, and go from there, because I'm not here to end century-long debates.
Yeah, and also, if you want a real-life view of the 7 deadly sins, look at history.
Yeah.
Pride has killed so many leaders. Greed has killed so many countries. Sloth. There are clear cases in earthly history that show these, especially if you look back at the Romans or the Mesoamericans, Mesopotamians. You can just look at history as a whole of the explanation of these 7 deadly sins causing a lot of harm and bringing the downfall of even the greatest of nations.
So just as a kind of a little fun aside, it's not really fun, it's just educational, I guess. I got this Orthodox prayer book. I've been visiting an Orthodox church since I've been here, and in that book, they include 9 ways of participating in another's sin. So I just wanted to go ahead and list those out, since I think those would be insightful. By counsel, by command, by consent, by provocation, by praise or flattery, by concealment, by partaking, by silence, and by defense of the sin committed. So I thought that was very interesting, because I was just thumbing my way through that, and I was like, well, that might be useful to include in this episode.
Yeah, I think it really, to me personally, it is, because when you are a child, it's not as well explained of how you can be complicit in one's wrongdoings.
Right.
And you have essentially, maybe not to the same level, but you are just as in the wrong as them. It's like one lie builds a million lies.
Yeah, pretty much leading to, if you notice sin, you might not have to just be like, hey, sinner, but you can try to do something, and with that, you benefit the both of you. Or,
Yeah, and that even
Go ahead.
that even ties in the real world law. Because if I know you're going to commit a crime, I'm complacent in that crime. And if something bad happens from that, you get prison time.
This is one thing that I do appreciate about the Orthodox Church is it's kind of, it's much more, not to say that other forms of Christianity aren't, but it feels much more practical and much more, there's a stronger emphasis on spiritual development and growth and changing how you are and quitting certain types of sins. There's just a much more practical air in that realm to kind of be like, hey, these are the things that you can acknowledge, like, this is what is wrong, so you can acknowledge like how to fix the problem, I guess.
Yeah. And
whereas other forms don't really do that.
And kind of from how you've been talking about it, just between all of us, it seems more so not necessarily fire and brimstone, but hey, there's these problems, let's work on them. Instead of fire and brimstone, change now, without giving kind of actual advice.
A solution.
Yeah.
Right.
Or a game
and
plan at least.
It seems more to be truly a change in lifestyle versus what we've seen in the area we grew up in, where it's a quote unquote change in lifestyle. Okay, you do the same shit Monday through Friday, party even harder on Saturday, and go ask for forgiveness Sunday. Because I've seen that so many times. But looking at the more traditional side has definitely kind of showed that there are people who take it seriously and they lead with a soft hand their followers of their section to hopefully more enlightenment, instead of just being like, yeah, you're wrong, not going to help you with it, you're wrong.
Yeah.
At least that's just my experience. I may be wrong.
Yeah. Well, the thing is, we're at a unique position in the show now where we've gone to all these different types of churches, and we've been doing the show for about a year now, and people have been listening, and we've probably got different people with different backgrounds. So no matter what we say, we're going to offend someone. Yeah. So that's a fun part. I mean,
you have Michael and I on here. We're going to offend somebody.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, because we can't just pinpoint each individual church in the world and like, well, see, this one does it good. This one. No, we have to look at our experiences, because I haven't been to 500 Southern Baptist Church or Methodist or Presbyterian. Yeah. I've been to a couple.
Yeah. And even when we went to those churches, like, those are samples, individual samples. There could be great variation, particularly within Protestant churches, of like what a denomination believes. So we're not here to like give final answers and stuff. We're just here to be like, this is what our experience is.
At least from a historical standpoint, with how the churches are run, falls from pretty much, there's a Jewish was like a Jewish council, and then that area got destroyed. So essentially, all rabbis are their own governance. And that's kind of how a lot of places within, like, especially the Protestant world, run.
Right.
I forget the name, but actually, just late one night, just saw a video like, oh yeah, here's how the three Abrahamic religions kind of govern themselves and whatnot.
Gotcha. Cool. Well, now that we're off of that rabbit trail, let's talk about the unforgivable sin.
Oh no.
Which is blasphemy of the Holy Spirit, which is probably something you should know if there's a sin that you can't be forgiven for. But there's, as always, there's backstory, there's padding to understand about this. So in Matthew 12, verse 31, it reads, "Therefore I say to you, any sin and blasphemy shall be forgiven people, but blasphemy against the Spirit shall not be forgiven." So let me explain. This is not to be taken as, don't you dare say anything bad about the Holy Spirit or I'll never ever forgive you. They probably still shouldn't say anything bad about the Holy Spirit. To understand why this is such a grave sin and why it's unforgivable, we have to understand what the Holy Spirit does. He guides Christians to repentance. To ignore the guidance of the Holy Spirit is to blaspheme with your actions as well as your words. Actions speak louder than words. So why this is unforgivable is simple. It's impossible to forgive. Someone who has blasphemed the Holy Spirit has hardened their heart and ignored him. It's simply impossible to forgive someone who won't listen. You can't apologize if someone doesn't speak. If this person does eventually listen and repents, then they haven't blasphemed the Holy Spirit. Blasphemy of the Holy Spirit is an irreversible state that happens after repeatedly rejecting the grace of God to the point where there's nothing he can do because accepting God's grace is up to you. Now, I probably just pissed off some Calvinists, but that's fine.
Hey, it is what it is, Chief. That's a nihilistic worldview anyway.
Anyway, I didn't know if you guys knew about the unforgivable sin. I just gave you a whole Bible lessons synopsis, pretty much.
Yeah, I mean, and as you mentioned earlier, I can't remember exactly when, but that kind of ties in with the ideological version of sin, which is the growth away from God, and to move yourself all the way facing the other direction, running. There, you can't come back from that because you're too far gone.
Right. So if you want to read more on this, I have a link in the show notes. This is kind of just like a little aside, but there's a lot of little things when you're talking about what is sin. There's a million directions you can go. So it was just kind of a conglomerate of a lot of things that I wanted to pull together with this. So moving on, I wanted to talk about, where does sin come from?
Are we talking biblically? Are we talking
the origins of sin?
The devil.
Origin. Through the temptation placed forth by the snake to Adam and Eve. Once they had given into that temptation, that was the downfall of man and the start of man's sinful nature. At least that's my idea.
Right.
Because
cool.
Lucifer was and still is the former archangel of temptation. He's now the devil.
Right. So you're basically right. Traditionally, the first sin was the betrayal of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. We can see silhouettes of pride, envy, and gluttony in Adam and Eve's choice to eat the fruit. This is how sin entered the world. But the chief of sins is pride, as Lucifer attempted to overthrow God's authority. Lucifer believed that he deserved to be God, a vain and prideful thought which led to his fall from heaven. This is why I say that pride is the essence of sin, because in some way, when we know something is a sin, but we do what we want anyway, is that not pride? Do we not constantly mimic the devil with our choices to take control and to try and play God in our own lives?
I agree with you there, Chief.
All right, well, I'm going to give you some really deep philosophical things to let simmer in your brain. All right, here comes motivational philosophy from some jackass on the internet, basically, which is me. That would be me. Anyway, now that I've ruined this setup. So basically, what I wanted to say is you are what you become. If you model yourself after sin, if you submerge yourself in sin and engage in nothing but sin, you will become a reflection of sin. If you model yourself after virtue, struggle against the flesh, and fight against your natural propensity towards sin, you will become a reflection of virtue. This is why there are only two destinations in the afterlife, heaven and hell. Because how you live your life is a reflection of what you believe and worship. There will be no agnostics in the end. And honest friends are able to tell you what you are modeling yourself after much better than yourself. than you can yourself. So keep those friends around.
Yeah, because again, what is the leader of all sin? Pride. And that pride is a thing telling you in the back of your head that everything's hunky-dory. The way you were going, just fine. There's nothing wrong. Keep doing that. Shit. You've been doing it for decades now. That's pride messing with you. And
Gotcha.
that's something that I've seen the real world execution of through people who struggle with, like, say, substance abuse. It doesn't seem like it's a problem. And the only time you know it's a problem is you're too far gone or you're dying. And sometimes you don't see it then. So keep them good friends around and listen to them.
Yeah.
Stop it.
Because they'll tell you what you're turning into.
Get help.
All right. Well, now we're going to get into, I guess, kind of the philosophy of sin and its kind of what the practical implications of it within a worldview is. So I think the concept of sin is necessary because the concept of sin accounts for human nature and our propensity towards evil actions. Without it, we are helpless victims to natural processes and brain chemicals. In other words, the monotheistic concept of sin accounts for what's wrong with the human race, whereas the secular model attempts to naturalize the problem and say, that's just how we are because of our chemistry. If you don't have a category for sin in your worldview, your understanding of the human condition is skewed and limited. So this is kind of getting at, like, obviously sin is not unique to Christianity. It's unique to the Abrahamic religions. But it's kind of been shoehorned into modern culture as like a category. But like under atheism, sin doesn't really exist. There's immoral things, but there's not necessarily a specific category for sin. And there's not a theological explanation behind sin to explain why we are the way that we are. So I think that's one of the things that's very beneficial about those religions is it has a utilitarian function behind it to explain how we are as a human race. What are your thoughts?
Me, the way I look at it is the essence of what sin is can be found outside of religion, because you'll hear people say things like, it's what separates us from the animals. It's how society keeps going. But the nature of it is left to more, what's the word? I'm looking for a word. I'm reaching, but it's just not coming. So essentially, it's looked more of a progression of society instead of a innate, this is what we have to work against. This is what we need to better ourselves with for spiritual enlightenment. Because without that part, there's a lot of little sins that might not have immediate reactions, like a little white lie, selling a candy bar from a store, little things like that. It might be reprehensible if caught. You're not always caught. And so that's what the more non-religious side is missing in my eyes to viewing of sin. It's like having a cake with no icing. There's nothing there.
Right. What do you think, David?
Yeah, I mean, it kind of like with essentially it falls into like the kind of creation idea. Like, where did, say, we all know things are wrong, where did, say, like killing someone be seen as bad, or like stealing, or even little white lies? And with, say, sin, sure, some could be like core fundamentals. I mean, take, for example, in Shintoism, you don't want to break something because it's seen as having a soul too. But without all of that, it falls into just where did say we decide things are wrong. Kind of
Right.
falling back into what Michael says.
Yeah, and one little aside.
Yeah, because of, as you said, in modern society, sin, well, at least more like US, Europe, and everywhere, it's viewed, sin is kind of innately that category where other places maybe not so as much.
Yeah, but one little aside is I couldn't believe in a religion where every little thing I broke had a soul, because I'd be in some big trouble. I'm pretty clumsy.
They might be right. You are in big trouble.
Oh, they're gonna get me. They're gonna get me. They're coming from boys.
Yeah,
That's
I
it.
guess
Pack it
kind of what I'm trying to get at here is like because this is a big theme with the show, is just kind of, I guess, comparing and contrasting Christianity with secularism or atheism, depending on who you are, what do you want to call it. Christianity has this explanation of humanity and humankind and our problem, which is sin. Atheism or secularism doesn't. It doesn't really explain like why we are just in general we're not always the best people. So it kind of, and this also gets back to the moral question of like, this is why I wanted to cover morality so early on in the show, is because it touches so much of what we're going to talk about. Like these two views of morality, there's like objective morality and subjective morality. And under subjective morality, you have, the main leading one is relativism. And then under objective morality, you have this kind of religious moral lawgiver kind of thing from God. And these are two very diverging forms of thought. And there's just a lot of, I don't know where I'm trying to go with this. Basically, you have like objective morality and the idea of sin on the religious side, and then you have no concept of sin, and effectively you're left with moral relativism on the atheistic side. And to me, the objective morality, as we talked about in the morality episode, paired with the concept of sin, seems to describe what is going on in the world a little bit better to me. And it makes more sense that like, if objective morality exists, then God exists, as we see our episode on that if you want to know more about that. But between that and the explanation of sin, like this seems like a more accurate description of what is actually going on in the world. Whereas atheism on those areas just kind of leaves you high and dry.
Yeah, see, the way I've looking into it a little more on the theistic side of morals, it is an answer to a question. It's like, hey, this is naturally from creation. Things that are wrong, things that are right, things that are virtuous, so on and so forth. Where in the more secular worldview, it seems there's more questions being asked and more rhetoricals of like, say, hey, I guess killing's wrong now? Or
it's a big Socratic circle, essentially.
Yeah.
Well, that's what I mean by it getting into relativism, is that like it's just like you essentially create your own morality and then essentially you're God at that point.
Yeah. And
well, not just
a lot of times
I wouldn't but say like your government dictates a lot of kind of, or maybe not government, but the society we live in. Yeah.
Right. Which is a collection of people, which collectively is God in that scenario. So these other things or people become God in that sense.
Yeah, and that's why you can look at different religions and where they were founded, especially the weirdo cultish ones. And you can clearly see, due to their personal ideology when they founded this religion, the morals that they withhold from the culture and from any underlying text that they may have or may not have used, or how they'll just leave some of the moral questions out of it.
Mm-hmm.
When you look at these weird culty religions, and then you see that, yeah, this thing was founded 5 years ago. I can tell because this wasn't a problem until then.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, do we have any other thoughts on that, or are we going to move on to the last part?
Don't matter to me.
All right. Well, if David doesn't have anything to say, then I guess I'll move on.
Let's go.
All right, cool. So the last part is the concept of sin is offensive. It is offensive to sinners because people who live in sin don't want to hear about what they're doing with their lives is wrong. However, not telling someone that they're sinning would be unloving because sin damages their relationship with God. So kind of for this last part, I want to talk to Christians in the audience and ask, like, how should Christians call people out on their sins? Well, first of all, don't be that guy who goes around judging everyone without keeping themselves in check. In fact, there's a biblical prohibition of this. In Matthew 7, verse 4, it says, quote, "How can you say to your brother, 'Let me remove the speck in your eye,' and look, a plank is in your own eye," end quote. So if you struggle with, for example, sexual sin, you need to fix that before trying to help someone else in that area. Also, if you're telling someone who isn't religious that they're sinning, they're probably going to take what you have to say with a grain of salt, because atheism, for example, doesn't have a category for sin. What you're saying is going to be white noise. So that was kind of like a callback there to what I just said that basically.
You're breaking the rules you're trying to lead me to. Which, I mean, we've had conversations about that quite a while back. Complaining.
So let me be clear. Christians should tell others when they are sinning. We are to hold each other accountable, after all. However, it should be done in a loving way, not a condemning way. Does the individual know you care? Or do they think you're just being judgmental? Is there trust? Can you be frank? Have you checked your own sins? Are you being a hypocrite? All of these things will affect how willing the other person is to listen to you. It's a difficult conversation to have sometimes, but it's a command for Christians to love their neighbors. And sitting back and just letting them walk off the deep end of sin is not loving.
Yeah, in my eyes, even in a non-Christian worldview, you should still communicate with your friends when they're fucking up. Because a lot of the times, and also check your shit at the door. Because if you're not willing to work on it yourself, but you're asking someone else to do the work, you're just a hypocrite and you're full of shit. But if you don't have to be, nobody's perfect. So, like, if I have a problem, like my problem's A, working on A, trying to get better with A, and I see someone else struggling with it, I can look at myself and like, I am working on this, and I also want them to see that this isn't the only way. They don't have to struggle with this. They too can progress. And this is for atheists, agnostics, Christians. Don't come with a higher than thou perspective and like, well, back in my day, I used to do this and that and this. No, they don't necessarily need to hear you're higher than thou, I'm better than you. They need your humility. They need your care. Like a child doing wrong, are you going to punch that kid? Or are you going to be like, hey, let's talk about this? You shouldn't.
That's what I was getting at, definitely. Just
don't be prideful.
Don't be that guy. Right.
Yeah. Check your 7 deadly sins at the door, kid. Be honest with yourself. And I think it's a quick side note. That's why when I look at all these self-help bullshit people like Dr. Phil, who are you to tell me what I'm doing wrong when you got dirty laundry that you're not facing? And I think in a lot of more modern versions of Christianity, that's a big problem I hold with it. Because it's like, hey, preacher, I know all your dirty laundry. Who are you to play God to me and pretend you're better? Now, if we had a more, not necessarily equal level of communication, but a more understanding level of communication, it wouldn't come off that way. But that's why, in my eyes, the fire and brimstone doesn't work. Unless you decide that that's what you want. It pushes more away than it pulls. Whereas the more humble approach, like Father Mark, the Orthodox, that was his name, right?
Right.
Okay. The way he approached it and the way the Anglican preacher approached it was really humble. Really, I'm a sinner, you're a sinner. We're all in this together kind of approach. And I think that leads to more fruitfulness, whether you're religious or not.
I have one question for you.
Yes.
And this maybe is begging the question, but you said even from a non-religious standpoint, you still ought to call people out when they're doing something wrong. Why?
Well, because looking at it from a secular point of view, if you're, depending on what your personal end goal is, I know there are so many, but we live in a world that's already so divided, that's already so full of hate between different groups, that I still think it's your duty to not be a piece of shit. And like if you see an addict who is looking for help, I
understand what you're saying. In society, reprehensible to not give that hand, because I understand what you're saying, like morally, like it's a good thing to be moral instead of not. But why ought you be moral is the question that I'm asking. That's what I'm getting at, is like the more meta question.
Yeah. Well, again, it goes down to what one's view of the world is, because some people innately view the world as chaotic and evil, and why should I give a shit? And you're not going to change their ideas. It's not going to happen. But most secular people I meet still have goals and have things they want to see the world do to better itself as a society. And so I'm mainly thinking of those people, because I don't really associate with the ones that just want to do fuckery to do fuckery.
Right. Yeah, I would grill those people on why. I mean, and this is a foreshadow. We're going to do an episode on nihilism here soon. Why be good? Why do good things if you don't believe in God? If you don't believe in absolute good, it's arbitrary. So I mean, like, why do good over doing evil? Obviously, society rewards good over evil. But beyond that minute motivation, why not just do whatever you want to do? If you're doomed, if you were ultimately just going to dirt, why not do whatever you want to do? Why not be a nihilist if you don't believe in God?
The one thing I somewhat disagree with is that society naturally rewards good, because you can look at people in power. You can look at convenience of life. Doing good is usually...
Well, you don't go to jail if you don't, kill people, for example.
Yeah.
That's kind of an implicit reward.
You can get away with killing people.
I know.
You can get away with it, and you can walk
What I'm saying
free.
is, generally speaking, there's a punishment for immoral behavior.
Yeah. But if you succeed at immoral behavior, you can find your way to the top real quick. It's kind of what I'm getting at on the more socio-political side of that. Because a lot of men in power are a lot of awful people.
Yeah. All right.
So it's kind of a two-sided coin there.
I will leave that there because we are going to talk about nihilism and the meaning of life and suicide, all that. It's just going to be one big episode here pretty soon. But as we're wrapping up, what are your final thoughts? How has your understanding of sin changed since the beginning of this episode and our pastoral interviews?
Me personally, my ideas of it have stayed the same because it's still something from something greater than myself that's ingrained. Like, hey, don't be shitty. And the understanding of the kind of hierarchical structure of sin and also the structure of its opposite, I think is very beneficial because it all too often we find ourselves looking at all the negative stuff because it's easier to pinpoint. It's a lot harder to pinpoint good things that you might not even think of. So I do like that you brought that up with this because I think that is a part that a lot of people miss.
Gotcha.
And I mean, I wear a symbol of humility every day for a reason. And how about you, David?
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah, David.
Has it changed?
it's essentially kind of the same thing you're going on about, but kind of like as you were listening, the 7 deadly sins and stuff, I'm just like, okay, so basically it's about moderating yourself and your own behaviors and kind of, as you know,
Self-control.
yeah, which as I said in my interview, like moderation's good for you. And kind of that's what in my head was just like, oh yeah, remember like saying not to kind of be a dick and kind of
Davidism 101
and moderate yourself. And it makes sense that from all that, pride's kind of the fundamental factor because pride leads to, oh, you think a little too high and mighty of yourself, so you can slack off, you can go do this. I think kind of in my eyes, it's like pride and vanity are quite tied together because if you
it's the same sin.
Yeah. It's like you think quite high mighty of yourself if you're very prideful or if you're very vain. Though I can see kind of pride being, it's not directly tied because you can still think like, oh, I'm terrible, but I'm not stopping this. And so pride in the way.
Right. Cool. All right. Well,
one last little thing. Even like in moderation, even the lack of pride in oneself can lead to complacency. So if you don't think of yourself enough to be like, hey, this awful shit's going on, I should do something about this, but I'm not good enough to do it. So I'm just gonna we'll mosey on to the right here. We'll avoid the stuff on the left.
Can I blow your mind for a second?
Hit me with it.
That's still pride.
Yeah.
If you hate yourself and you think nothing of yourself so much that you don't do anything, that's still pride. That's just an inverse form of pride. Because you're still thinking of yourself so much that you're not doing anything. That's still pride.
The absolute value of that negative is pride.
Yeah. But I think a lot of people won't, without the explanation, they hear pride and think of, thinking of yourself higher. They don't also think of the inverse, which back to languages again.
Cool. All right. Well, I think that is pretty much it for this episode. I think it was pretty good to kind of talk about that. So just as a quick purview of what's coming up next in the show, coming off of the pastoral interviews and church visitations, we're doing a couple episodes on theology and worldview implications. Not a super long series, maybe 4 or 5 episodes or so. And this is one of them, obviously. So that's what's going to be going out for the next month or so. And then we're going to be moving on to the series that everyone has been waiting for.
Where we offend
Politics.
everybody.
Yes, we're going to make everyone angry. And those are going to be good. So definitely stay tuned. Also, one other thing, we do hope to do a Q&A episode in the coming months. Don't know exactly when, just kind of depends on if/when we get questions. So if you have any questions for any of us or all of us or whatever, send it in to facingthegatespod@gmail.com or hit us up on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram at Facing the Gates. And I think that is all of the maintenance things that I have to wrap up this episode. So I'd say it's been real.
I'd say it's been fun.
I'd say it's been real fun. And
I agree.
we'll see you guys in the next one.
Yeah.
All right, bye-bye.